Hi, everybody. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about wildlife and forest crime. And we'll start off with this very famous picture in 2007 of a silverback that has been murdered or assassinated by what was thought at first to be poachers, and a total of 7 gorillas, 6 other gorillas. This particular one is the male silverback named Senkwekwe, and this photo was taken by a photographer named Brent Sturton. And in this picture, these are the people that live in the village and the park rangers that are transporting Senkwekwe back to where he's going to be buried. And it turns out they were a killing associated with the illegal charcoal industry, which is in this part of Africa is a $30 million a year business. And it was a power statement by the charcoal industry against the conservation movement. So a militia group killed these gorillas as a political statement to fight against the conservation movement. And they killed Senkwekwe and all the members of Senkwekwe's family, and the only remaining individual was a daughter of his that they found that was 2 months old, and they ended up raising her in captivity. She just passed away in 2021, unfortunately. Okay, so in this picture here, we have a woman who is being detained, in this case, for hauling illegal charcoal that was obtained inside the park, which is against the law. And so poor people are hired as mules to haul charcoal from one spot to another. And this poor woman is now being arrested, although the real powers behind the charcoal production are rebel groups and people like these women who have very little or no economic opportunities, and so they engage in these illegal activities. So the term mule is often a term used when you're talking about just being forced to sort of carry a large number of things. But there's also a use of the term money mule, which is when people are used to transport or move products or do certain things where it's really illegal and they may or may not know, but they can be arrested for that. So for example, if this woman was hired to carry this charcoal and paid some minimum type of salary to do so, if that crime is illegal and she doesn't know any better, it's still against the law and they can be arrested or penalized in one way or another for committing the crime. And so this is the location of Virunga National Park, and it has been a war zone since 1994, and it's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it lies between the border of Rwanda and Uganda. So there are two very large groups of people, just in case you don't know, in this particular region. So you have the Tutsis, which were traditionally cattle herders and typically had more power than the other large group, the Hutus. And the Hutus were farmers and had less political power. In 1994, a Hutus president was assassinated, and that sort of led to this tremendous civil war, if you will, between the Tutsis and the Hutus. The Tutsis were definitely a minority group, and so the Hutus had a much larger group of people, and in this political instability, the Hutus ended up killing almost 500,000 Tutsis in about 100 days. So that spilled across the borders then into the Democratic Republic of Congo, where this park lies. So some of the Hutus later formed these rebel groups, and these groups are using wildlife products and money from the charcoal industry to buy arms and support their operations. Before 1994, and really escalating in 1994 and continuing on now, there's been about 5.6 million people that have died in this region due to the conflict, which is the deadliest conflict since World War II in terms of number of casualties. And the park is now one of the most dangerous places in the world to practice conservation efforts. So park rangers undergo military-style training, and including ambush attacks. And there have been over 200 rangers have been killed in this park. First of all, why is wildlife and forest crime a serious transnational crime? Why isn't this just something that occurs among the people in a particular region? Why should the rest of the world care about that? Well, first of all, it's the fourth largest transnational crime in the world. We'll talk about other ones. Wildlife crime is a $23 billion trade that is destroying our planet. And so it's not just something that affects local groups of people. It's something that ends up affecting people all over. So wildlife poaching occurs across borders. There's 12 distinct militia groups operating in Virunga right now. So it's not just in that region, because wildlife poachers then spread to other regions. So here you can see an elephant, or what remains of an elephant that was obviously killed for its ivory. And in a recent study by U.S. Security Analysis, they found that ivory is the preferred currency for these militia groups. Wildlife poaching in some ways is a low-tech crime, for example, but not always, as I'll show you in a second. In this particular case, this is a simple snare trap that they use by stealing wire. But in other cases, it's a high-tech crime. Female rhino on the left was brutally attacked by poachers, and the men surveyed the area using helicopters. They mapped out the movements of the rhinos and where the guards would be, the park rangers, and they darted her using veterinarian drugs that they have access to, and then they used a chainsaw to cut off her horn. There's also human casualties involved. These are park guards that are killed between the ages of 20 and 40. Many of them have young children and no longer have breadwinners in the family, and the children are left without fathers. So 1,000 rangers were killed in the past 10 years, and you can note the number of rangers killed in places like Africa. You can see here, rangers are killed. Notice also in India, even in the United States, you notice there's a good number of park rangers that are killed in trying to defend or protect wildlife and forest areas. This guy here, Emmanuel de Merode, he is the director and chief warden of Virunga National Park. He was shot twice in 2014 while driving from Goma back to the park. And he became the director in 2008. And the previous director had been arrested earlier that year. He was behind the planning of that gorilla massacre. So imagine you have the director of the park that's supposed to be protecting the wildlife there, but yet they're in on a conspiracy to have them murdered. So Emmanuel de Merode came in, he cleaned up the ranger force. It went from 1,000 to 230 rangers, and now it's back up to 480, including 14 women. They had to get rid of a lot of the park rangers because they were part of this scam. And he increased salaries for these individuals from $5 to $200, which is enough to justify a zero tolerance for corruption. Now, just to point out how some of these things work, Emmanuel de Merode comes from a family with a lot of political power. He also is married to Louisa Leakey. And I don't know if you know that last name, Leakey, but that's the granddaughter of Louis Leakey, the famous anthropologist, maybe one of the most famous anthropologists in the world. So there's this sort of incredible power that comes with Emmanuel de Merode and his wife. They bring a lot of power and finances to a scenario like this. Not every place has sort of that ability, unfortunately. So Emmanuel de Merode is director-in-chief warden of Virunga National Park. He was hired because the previous director was arrested. So he cleaned up the ranger force, 230 rangers now back up to 480, including 14 women, which is a big deal, really, because opportunities for women to earn income is not something that happens in a lot of these types of communities that struggle with these types of things. So empowering women is quite often seen as a very powerful tool at fighting crime in many different ways. So the war on poaching can't be won in the field unless we take on the higher level of corruption that's going on, and this is a huge task. So wildlife and forest crime, there's huge financial gains, making it basically it's a low risk, high profit criminal activity. You notice up here, drugs are still at the top, offering $200 billion a year. Illegal logging is a $100 billion a year industry, and illegal wildlife trafficking is a $23 billion a year industry. So why is it critical to address wildlife and forest crime now? Well, it ends up influencing many aspects in your society. If you look at rhino poaching back in 2006 and compare it with rhino poaching in 2015, you see this, what's called a J-shaped curve, because it's basically exponentially growing very, very quickly. And it's slowing down now. And you see in 2016, notice this is the World Wildlife Fund's data. We mentioned them once before. And then if you go search this up, you can find data on 2018 and 2021, and you'll see that it is in fact decreasing. Now you have to be careful. You see some of these numbers and maybe you think, oh, things are better now. And they are, but if you look at this graph, so these are the number of black rhinos in Africa. And although poaching numbers are down now, so are the number of black rhinos in the first place. So it leads you to wonder, are the efforts of these conservationists really making that big of a difference? Or is it just simply there aren't nearly as many rhinos left that could be poached? And I suspect it's a little bit of both of those, unfortunately. So wildlife populations, many African species are being devastated, and that's robbing governments and communities of potentially very valuable resources because ecotourism is a source of income for many of these African communities. You might remember way back in the beginning of this class, we talked about ecosystem services, all the different things that ecosystems provide. And remember that number ends up being financially a huge number. Well, believe it or not, ecotourism is a huge industry and generates a ton of money. And not only that, but it's a wonderfully renewable system. You're not cutting down all your forests and taking them out. You're just taking people to see the same gorillas over and over again. And people, believe it or not, spend a lot of money going on ecotourism trips to see different types of things. I've never been to see gorillas in the wild per se, but I have spent a lot of money going to see certain reptiles and birds in other parts of the world. So over 30% of all the timber traded globally now comes from illegal sources. This is Mazoala National Park in the north end of Madagascar. Rosewood ended up in the United States and then being used by the Gibson Guitar Corporation in the manufacturing of the necks of their guitars. So this was reported by National Geographic, showing the illegal harvesting of this rosewood, in this particular case from Madagascar. So what are some of the contributing factors to the illegal wildlife trade? Well, one is going to be poverty. So in this particular case, this is a bushmeat poacher in the Serengeti National Park. And this person's a member of the Kore tribe. And prior to 1951, this tribe hunted on their ancestral lands in the Serengeti. The year the area became a national park, these people were removed and were no longer able to hunt. And today, few of them are employed by the park, but they're basically a forgotten people. And so bushmeat poaching is a complicated issue, and it's wrought with injustices and extremely complex socioeconomic and cultural factors. You might remember that we mentioned way back talking about Yellowstone National Park and the native people that were kicked out of there once it was formed into a national park. This is a picture just outside of Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it presses up against the park's border. And farmers here cultivate this exceptionally fertile terrain, but you have 4 million people trying to eke out a living in this region, and so some end up trespassing into the park to grow crops such as corn, cassava, and potatoes. There's simply not enough room for the number of people that are trying to make a living. So population growth is also a huge issue. Half of all the wild tigers live in India, where there are 1.2 billion people, and they register 60,000 births per day. So this is a road right alongside the national park with this fence. We've looked at this before. And there's a buffer area just outside the park. And in this aerial view, you can see where the park is and where this buffer area is. And just outside the road, you have a community where people are doing subsistence farming. They're using that land to grow crops, mostly farming wheat and things of that sort. But they use this buffer area to harvest timber for fuel wood and also for grazing their cattle. And then there's inefficient legal deterrent measures. And actually you have to address 3 things to stop the entire process. You know, like lots of other things, say drugs, for example, you have the supply and demand part. If you just go after the supply part, that's only part of the issue. So you also have to go after the demand. You have to stop the demand. And this is an interesting story. It was done in 2016 in Kenya. They took 105 tons of ivory and 1 ton of rhino horns, representing 6,500 elephants. 6,500 elephants and 450 rhinos that were killed for their horns. So what they did was they took all these confiscated rhino horns and ivory and they just burned them. They just totally annihilated them and got rid of them. So it led to cities to ban all international trade and ivory, and the elephant population slowly recovered. But then in 1997, portion of Africa, they lowered the status of elephant populations, enabling limited ivory sales once again. And if we fast forward to 2015, more elephants now are being killed than being born. So the populations are again on the decline because of that. So basically you have this huge base which represents the African continent as an example. And that's where, let's say, the ivory comes from, or in this case, perhaps the horns from the rhinos. And there's a bottleneck at Southeast Asia where the ivory comes to the surface again to cross borders to spread then to other countries. And so there's this bottleneck, and the idea is that if you can stop the process not only just in Africa, but also in the Southeast Asia bottleneck, you can have a much bigger, tremendous impact on whether those reach other places such as China. Low input costs involved in the trade in many regions, meaning that it's just not all that expensive for individuals or groups to engage in illegal wildlife activity. They don't need sometimes very expensive equipment. For example, these rangers here are holding wire snares that they confiscated. And again, the penalties are not necessarily all that high. Okay. Another issue we have is a deepening wildlife conflict that occurs sometimes with people. So, for example, in parts of Africa and also in parts of Asia, you have these human-elephant conflicts, human-tiger conflicts. There are other versions of that as well. Or a raiding elephant can destroy an entire crop in just minutes. They can go through and obliterate that area. There have been over 200 people in the last 15 years, for example, that have been killed by elephants in the wild. Human-tiger conflicts are also a serious problem. Remember, I showed you that picture where you had that tiger reserve, and then you had the buffer zone where people were doing things like sustainable agriculture, or we're growing wheat, for example, and then harvesting wood. Well, the tigers don't really know where the reserve stops or ends, and when there's a flood or just individual tigers are looking for food, they might leave the park, end up eating cattle. They have killed humans before. Lots of people have been killed by tigers or wounded by tigers. They'll prey on people's livestock, and so villagers then retaliate, and the result is the killing then of tigers. So there are dedicated people that care about animals, and they risk their lives to protect them. So this is a complex issue. It's a serious issue, and there's a number of people that are spending their lives trying to address these issues, but much work needs to be done to address wildlife and forest crimes. Okay, so hope you're all having a good night, and I will talk with you all soon.